Welcome everybody. Today we're jumping into Eymbr AI and how it integrates with Tenable OT Security. This has been a topic we've been waiting on for a really long time. This is going to be leveraging AI's capabilities and parsing and working with Tenable OT data in ways that a dashboard could never do. So let's go ahead and jump in. The first thing we need to do is log into Eymbr AI. I'm going to go to the back end. I'm going to go to admin. I'm going to go down to Tenable OT Security. And we need some very basic information here. We're going to need to know the IP address of our Tenable OT Security appliance, and we're going to need to generate an API key so that we can connect securely into that back end of Tenable OT Security. So let's go grab first our IP address. We'll put that in. And then next we'll need an API key. Let's go to Tenable OT Security, go to Settings, API Keys, and we'll generate a new API key just for Eymbr. I'll say Generate. I'll copy my key. I'll go back to my admin panel. I'm going to paste my key in, and then I'm going to test my connection. It looks like our connection's good. It even found several assets and events. I'm going to select Enable. I'm going to make sure my automatic syncs are turned off, and I'm going to save my configuration. Saving the configuration requires a restart so that we get the new token allocations. One of the things that happens when we integrate with Tenable OT Security, it moves over into like a SOC analyst or a threat hunting mode. So we use more tokens on that data and less on things like past conversations. This will take a few minutes for us to reload. Once it fully reloads, we'll be back at the login screen. All right, it looks like we're up and running. I'm going to go to my admin section again. I'm going to go to Tenable OT Security and just make sure that everything is good. So we're enabled, we have our IP address, and we have our key. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run a sync. Now you can ignore this failed. I stopped one earlier before this video just to make sure we would have all of our zeros in here and you can see how everything syncs up. So I'm going to go ahead and say run sync now. I'm going to say okay, and it's going to start the synchronization process. This could take several minutes. Be patient because we're pulling in over 60,000 records. So you'll see this now that we have 440 assets, we have 312 policies, we have a sensor that's out there running, we have all these different findings, backplanes, vulnerabilities, even event aggregations that we're looking at. And then you'll see that we have a note down here. And this note says that we have 493,000 unresolved events in Tenable OT. So one of the things that we do with Eymbr is we look at the quality of data, not just what the data is, but can we trust that data? And with having so many unresolved events, what we've done is we pulled an aggregate of those events. That's what that 1,000 is. We pulled them all together and we said, hey, there's a lot of duplicates. There's a lot of bad event data. We only pull the details on 500 of those. You should probably go out to Tenable OT and tune your policies to reduce those false positives and then resync again. So there's even some analytics on the back end that tells you how healthy is Tenable OT when we pull this data in. Where does the real work start? Where does the real value start? Now that we have the data, that we pulled in all the records, how can we use this in a meaningful way? Well, let's return back to chat. Now I can ask several questions of Eymbr now that's very specific to my environment. So let's say something like, what's my most vulnerable asset? If I go in and I ask specifically what is that, she'll come back and give me some very specific information about that asset. Now it's going to take a little while. She's going to go through this thinking process. She's going to look at everything and how it relates. She's going to draw correlations between events and those assets and any vulnerabilities that are out there. And then over everything, she's going to come back and say, this is your most vulnerable asset. And hopefully she tells us why. So if you look based on our OT security data, your most vulnerable asset is Perseverance with a serial number. It says what it is. It's a Rockwell automation. It has a model number, firmware. It has 5 active critical high severity vulnerabilities listed. And it will go in and talk about like there's multiple high vulnerabilities. They're commonly targeted in these environments for this firmware version. There's some risk context here for us, talking about like how frequently these things are attacked via code uploads or PLC stop techniques, and then recommendations around that specific device. What if we want to go a little bit deeper? What if we want to like look, is there any real vulnerabilities on this? Like, are there any CVEs related, for example? Or what's the attack pathway? And why don't we look at that? Why don't we ask, like, what's our attack pathway to this device? And now what will start coming in is not just the vulnerability piece of this device, but it'll start looking at MITRE attack frameworks. It'll look at different ways that this device may be compromised. And what is this device talking to? And we have a lot of information here now, right? So when we start talking about pathways, it's going to come back saying, okay, this is the way initial access could get in through these engineering workstations. For example, engineering workstation number 25 can serve as a gateway to this PLC. Stations often run unsecured protocols like HTTP or Telnet. And then if you start looking, there's a policy finding of all these high hits of Rockwell PLC stops coming from this engineering workstation. As a matter of fact, we have over 9,000 active hits showing this repeated interaction. So now we're starting to get more and more data, not just like what are my vulnerabilities or what are the CVEs I have to address, right? But now it's starting to dig into pathways and weaknesses across both of them. What do I need to focus on? It even talks about how can I get lateral movement from one to the other? How can I directly exploit this specific vulnerability? And so let's say we're talking about, we have this CVE out there that's talking about, I have this Windows print spooler that could be on that particular Windows engineering workstation that's tied back in as a part of the pathway that can get to my controller. So now it's not just looking at what's one CVE, it's looking at CVEs on that Windows device that actually has access to Perseverance as a controller. So it goes super deep. A lot of times you're not going to see this in a dashboard where you see how people can pivot or exploit one thing to like pivot to another. And then there's all this manipulation that goes in there as well. So I could take this a step further and I could say, hey, can you tell me more about a specific CVE, for example, this spooler, or I can ask for any CVEs related to this controller and really dig in on any of these. So let's say we want to know about CVEs related to this particular controller. So I can simply say, so now I want to dig in not just the CVEs on the Windows workstation as a pathway, but I want to understand the CVEs related specifically to this controller. And are there any? It said there were typically a lot related with Rockwell, but we want to know the actual CVEs related to this one. All right, so what we can see is that on Perseverance, we have high or critical severity vulnerabilities, but specific CVE identifiers have not been listed. And this comes into Tenable's plugin data set. So there may be plugins, there may be vulnerabilities that are seen, but they're not necessarily tied to a specific CVE, and that's good to know. So instead of coming in and saying that you have making up data about CVEs, it's actually going to tell you there's no CVEs associated with this. These are primarily around these PLC starts and stops and those kind of things. So, but to give you an idea of what the CVE data would look like, let's go ask about the Windows CVE that we saw earlier. So we're going to ask Eymbr to dive in to give us all the details on this CVE. Now, one of the things you can do when you're asking for details is about a CVE, for example, is I said, hey, can you explain this more like I'm a fifth grader? And not to be insulting, but I wanted to understand this in a way that makes sense. I want simple explanations around what the CVA may be. Now, she was pretty fast while we're doing this, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. You can see she starts giving analogies for how this works. It gives me details around that CV in ways that I can actually understand it. So this is a way of really like diving into CVEs and looking at them or any data and making it really easy to digest. Now, the next thing we know is we know the pathway, we know the CVEs, we've got some of that explained to us, but we really need a plan. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and say, hey, can you build me a step-by-step plan to fix this? So all I'm going to do is say, build me a step-by-step plan to address this device and its risk. All right, let me scroll back up. So when we asked for Eymbr to build me a step-by-step plan, she actually came in and built phases for me. The first being immediate containment, making sure that this truly is a threat and validating whether this is unauthorized or authorized activity. If it turns out that it's something that we need to investigate further, we need to start isolating those critical assets in a way that does not shut down the plant or the operation, but it also needs to address any of the risks that are out there. Then we'll go in and audit for firmware and patching, go in and actually address individual specific risk. For example, CVEs that may be out there related to the Windows systems that are connected to it. Look at network hardening, segmenting your network engineering stations, enforcing secure protocols, making sure that we're not crossing boundaries, and then how can we monitor to make sure that we fix those. And then you have some other things like long-term remediation. And then there's some critical notes around this, including like devices that are out there, event history, and even MITRE ATT&CK framework alignment and what's going on that side too. So it'll give you a step by step. You could even take this a step further and say, write me an email or write me a paper on this remediation, or tell my team what's the level of effort that needs to happen. So Eymbr's really designed in this mode to be that helper of a SOC analyst or somebody doing threat hunting, where you would spend hours and hours digging into logs and events and investigating each thing. Eymbr allowed to come along beside that analyst and say, look here, this is what's important. This is the area that I would dive into. Instead of going through what we saw, hundreds of thousands of events, now I can get very focused on what's important, what it needs to address right now, what can wait till later. Hopefully this video has been helpful. If it has, please hit that like button. Until next time, have a great day.